Thank you for staying for the last session. This is usually the part where everyone is a bit sleepy and heavy-headed, especially after snacks. Maybe I'll start it with sort of a personal story. So if you're within the field, you might have heard about COP26. It's essentially the conference of the parties that takes place on an annual basis, where policymakers come and sit and negotiate, trying to figure out a pathway through dealing with this changing climate. So we've been to yet another one last year, and it was in Glasgow this time. And I decided, for a change of weather, maybe start walking in the outdoors. Closer? Oh, sorry. Is that okay? Okay. So, no slides for me. So at the end of it, essentially, we decided to take a walk outdoors in Scotland. In Scotland, they have these small hills that they call Munros. They're not so small. They're around at least 300 feet tall. And I decided, why not? After being stuck in halls that are quite small and windowless and with little air to breathe sometimes, why not walk in the great outdoors? The first thing that I stumbled upon was wet feet. And essentially, these wet feet were the direct result of walking in a bog. A bog, if you know Scotland, is essentially really wet terrain full of these small, humble mosses called sphagnum. So this sphagnum is actually quite interesting. If you think of World War I, the height of really gruesome deaths, there's this really innovative Scottish surgeon and botanist that thought, well, since we're running out of these sort of bandages to heal the wounds, why don't we stuff these little mosses? These mosses contain within them the ability to heal, the ability to suck out the putrid smells of these wounds, and at the same time, we're able to hold 22 times their size in water and in liquid. But these bogs were not left there in Scotland by chance. They found the right kind of environment to grow, but we've heard that maybe the Romans got them with them in their conquests. So man has been leaving their imprint on nature, or what's called natural, for so many years. It's only been accelerating over the past few years. So this has been happening for thousands of years and increasing at an incredible rate over the past 20, 30 years or so. So well before any of us have realized that imprint, we found ourselves stuck in a conundrum. We need to be tending to our lands and to our seas and continuing to reap their benefits in a way that does not impact the future generations' ability to do so. And we need to do so with a changing climate. So how can we leverage our endowments and ambitions today? How can we chart novel and new pathways together for a better tomorrow? So very simply put, today we're going to narrow down the main challenges. If you think of it as the diagnosis stage, trying to figure out what's wrong with us, then trying to figure out tomorrow of ways and pathways of finding solutions before we put our heads together to implementing them. So I compel everyone here to listen, reflect, and please do challenge some of our contributions to the discussion. I'll propose the following outline, since we've got some really good speakers with us here today. We'll start with the basics, hopefully, if Professor Hoteit is here, of climate science, trying to wrap our head around what is changing within our climate and how can we capture it in a way that actually is useful for the policymaker. We'll then look at the threats of food and trade security, finding metrics and indicators that would help us measure. We cannot manage what you cannot measure. Reimagine an operating model that envisions public-planet partnership. And most importantly, I think, in Saudi, we've been re-energized, hopefully with the effort of Dr. Khaled and other people flagshipping these efforts of trying to target tree plantation for Saudi Arabia. So how can you manage that while tackling and solving for food security? So we have with us an esteemed set of speakers with us today, with Dr. Khaled Abdulkader, the CEO of the National Center for Vegetation Cover and Combating Desertification. Dr. Khaled, thank you for coming. We also have Professor Ibrahim, who's the Professor of Earth Science and Engineering at KAUST, who will walk us through the climate science. Professor Kenneth Strzepek, who's the Climate, Water, and Food Specialist at MIT Jameel Water Food Systems Lab, who I think my most favorite hat of his has been equally a collaborator on a piece that we'll be publishing in collaboration with Community Jameel on the state of climate and health research. In the GCC, you cannot look at the health component without looking at the food and agriculture and systems. So we want to really focus with him today on highlighting the main threats to food trade and security in the kingdom. We also have Dr. Luomi, who's a research fellow at KAPSARC for climate and sustainability, who will explore different ways of measuring that interaction between climate, food security, and how could we quantitatively measure that interaction. And we also have Mrs. Leena Olaimy, who's the founder and CEO of Symbaoisis Trillion Tree Fund, who will frame what would the public planet partnership look like. So without further ado, Professor Hoteit, you have the floor. We look forward to hearing all about the regional climate change and food security in Saudi Arabia. So Professor Hoteit.
Mashael, let's go to Ken.
Okay.
So,
well, I would have loved to sort of frame the science behind it, but we'll get to hear a bit more from Professor Khaled in a minute. Maybe we'll jump to Professor Ken, that will talk to us about the threats to food trade security in Saudi Arabia. So Professor Ken, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. It is a pleasure to be with all of you today, even from a long way away. And so will you have my slides on the screen now?
Oh, they're controlled. They're controlled by you. You have to share your slides.
Oh, okay, fine. I have that here, just a minute. Okay. Okay, share slides coming. Share. Okay, so do you have, are you seeing my screen now?
Perfectly.
Yes, we are.
Okay, good. So what we want to take today is, we're talking about global change, climate change today, but climate change does not take on its characteristics in a vacuum. It's part of global change. And so we want to take a look at the threats to food security on a bigger perspective, and they're all very much interlinked, especially for the GCC and for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So we're going to start out with that and take a quick journey through this issue, and then hopefully we have a big dialogue at the end. Food security, the definition that comes from the FAO is the ability to have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. Now, food security is based on 4 major pillars. The availability, sufficient supply of that food. That supply does not have to be generated locally, which is the difference between food self-sufficiency is that you grow your own food, and availability is the ability to bring that supply to your nation. Access, once it's there, is it easy to get access to through the markets and other systems, and do people have the resources to access and purchase that? Utilization, know how to use that, but also finally the stability in doing all of these 3. So we need to keep a steady, constant flow of food, and that's what we're going to look at today. So we'll look at this in a minute in the details, but if you see, this is the global food trade system of 5 major staples. And what you see is the source areas, which are in orange, ending up towards the Middle East and the GCC, and you see those pathways that are there, and you'll notice a number of important things that we'll highlight as we go through. So this is a global issue. To provide food security for the kingdom, it is part of a global activity. So one of the first threats we've seen to that, and we're going to point out threats that you may not have thought about, but have been real over the past 2 to 3 years. One is the pandemic. And you'll see lots of papers out there that the pandemic has broken the global food supply chain. Just myself here in the US, the price of meat has almost doubled. Some of the staples are difficult to get because of all of the aspects related to the pandemic, which we will not get into detail. The next thing is there are what we call maritime shipping. And as we know, a lot of food to the Middle East and to GCC comes from Russia and Ukraine. There's a bottleneck through the Bosporus. There's a bottleneck through the Suez Canal and through these other points 3 and 4. And what did we see this year? But we found the Evergreen tanker blocked the Suez Canal. And for 6 days, the supply chain of food to the Gulf, as well as many other products, were held up. So that is a real one that we've just observed. Finally, there's a threat of conflict. And as you'll see, Ukraine and Russia are major suppliers of grains to the world. And it is very easy to predict that there will not be harvest from Ukraine this year, as well as other disruptions we're already seeing because of sanctions on the Russians. So what is that going to do to food prices and availability of food? These are real conflicts that are now. But what we want to look at is it's not just going to happen to the GCC, it's going to happen and hit Africa as well. The world will be affected by both oil and energy prices and food prices from this conflict. Now, if we look at climate change, and I'm going to here on the left give you a little headlight of what my colleague is going to share a little bit later, but these are the changes in precipitation that we're seeing. And in this West Asia region, most of the models, and this is an average of the future around 2050, are showing the green regions that there's going to be some increases in annual precip, but in the GCC, we're going to see decreases of already dry conditions. And the more scary one here is the changes in mean annual temperature that we're seeing for 2050 from the RCP 8.5, the most extreme condition. And if we do not mitigate, we can see in Saudi and where we are up to 6 degrees warming over the year. Incredibly warm things that will have impact on Saudi's own supply. However, what does it mean for the world? Well, if we look by 2050, recent work that we've done through the International Food Policy Research Institute shows by 2050, under the scenario you're seeing on the left, almost all the yields of grains and commodities that we saw flowing around the world are going to drop anywhere between 3 to 8% in their yields. What does that mean? And what's important here is to see over in the far right-hand upper corner is what's going to be the increase in world market prices. And one of the reasons that it's going to be increasing is that's a yield drop with all the technology going on. This is looking at the future with 2050 without climate change and economic and technological change. And then we throw on it the threat of climate change, and we see grains going up by 30%, rice increasing 24%, oil seeds up to 31%. So a very big impact on the global scene in terms of prices. And so when there's food trade, that may be good for the exporters, but it's bad for the importers. Will we be able to pay for it? And if we look globally, what the IFPRI model is showing us here is that without climate change, there will be trade between the developed and developing world of almost 234 million metric tons of food. Because of climate change, that drops to 93 million. Significant drop because there is not the availability, and with the price of these crops, changing the food system by 2050 dramatically. So what does it look like in detail for the kingdom? And so as we look at this here, we're taking and looking at Saudi, what's going to happen? So we're looking here at the top, how much of Saudi's grains, 60% of their grains are imported. Their major importers are Ukraine, Russia, Argentina, Australia, and Poland. And the percentage of importers from each. So right now, Ukraine is 19%, almost 20%, and 14%. So over 1/3 of all your grains are now coming from a region where and you add Poland in there, where there is great conflict. Now, when we look to what the global climate models are saying, it says by 2050, we expect increases in grain yields in Saudi and decreases in Russia. More importantly, let's get that back. We look at rice. 99% of the rice is imported, and of that, 62% from India, 10 from US and China. So you have one dominant partner, and that's projected to decrease by 20% there in India. And with their population growing, what is that going to have impacts on the supply of rice? And you can see that going down through all of the other processes, your processed food and whatever. So this leads to the question of how do we develop our partners and our supply chain to the future? So for looking at this, we're undertaking the Jameel Water and Food Systems Lab, along with a new organization that has started called the Food and Climate Systems Transformation Alliance, which is a group of researchers led by MIT and supported by the community Jameel. We're developing a global food and trade vulnerability index that will look at current conditions, the kind of indicators we just showed you there, but then looking to the future and based on the latest climate science and the latest economic modeling with the International Food Policy Research Institute, look at projections for the future so that policymakers can make the right decisions as they look at food security for Saudi, for GCC, and for around the world. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to interacting later.
Thank you very much, Professor Ken. And without further ado, Professor Khaled, I think you're justifiable for being late, honestly, because your findings are quite intriguing, and we're very keen on seeing how we could focus on sort of modeling that's more relevant or useful to the policymaker or the decision maker altogether. So the floor is yours.
So I imagined a different start for the talk, but let me apologize. Really, I'm very sorry for being late. I will get urgent request from the ministry, and this would explain why I'm late. So I'm very sorry for making you wait. Do we have the slides in there? Or? So I just have a few slides describing the state of the climate over our region.
Sorry, keep talking.
I need to remember since the slide.
Yeah, sure. You up here?
Yes.
This is you. Perfect. Magic of technology. Go away.
Thank you very much. So it's just a few slides describing the state of our climate and actually what we know, and more is what we do not know. And this hopefully will give some thoughts for our discussion at the end of this session. I'm not going to talk about food security. You know, you all know definitely, certainly better, more than me, what's going on. But as everyone knows, the food consumption, the food in Saudi Arabia is mostly imported. So if you want to study the impact of climate change on the food security in the kingdom, you want also to look at what's happening globally. And I'll start from this global picture that everyone expects to see know what's going on. I'm showing the temperature projections globally from CMAP 6 between 86. The changes from the period 86 to 2005 on the near term, mid-term, and long term for temperature and for precipitation. And as you all know, we're expecting temperatures to increase globally, and also to the rainfall, actually, more rain on the tropics, less rain in the subtropics. And the picture is consistent whether you're looking for CMAP 5 or the previous projections from CMAP 5. So this is the typical picture that we all know about. And if we look at the FAO impact of these climate projections on the yields globally, and I put in here in blue the countries where the regions where Saudi Arabia is importing from. They are expecting in green is where there is increase in grain. There is again in the crops, and in yellow and orange there is there is a modest increase, and in orange there is a reduction in the crops. So, for instance, Saudi imports, as far as I know, wheat from Europe, and in there are projected increase. For rice, for instance, where they are imported from Asia, there is a projected decrease in rice. And by 2050, there is a decrease by 11% projected based on the climate change projections. Now, okay, the numbers do not seem that alarming, but given that the population is expected to grow by 9 billion globally, an increase in food to meet this increase is expected. We need around 70% increase in food, not decrease, and these things becomes much more alarming than they may look like. Now, if we zoom over our region and want to see, I got interested lately of, okay, what these projections look like over our region. We started here by looking at CMAP6, how good the CMAP6 are over our region during the period where we have data. Okay, so we're comparing temperature up, precipitation down, and over the periods where we have data, ERA 5 as data-driven product, and we believe it over the periods where we have data, the picture is quite consistent, whether it's coming from CMAP6 or it's coming from ERA 5, whether it's for temperature or precipitation. We have higher resolutions from the reanalysis products, and you can see it clearly, but the patterns are very much alike, and they match very well. CMAP6 models did a good job in tuning the models to match the data period historically. And then if we believe, and we move forward with this CMAP6, we can look at the projections on the near term, mid-term, long-term, how they change with respect to CMAP6, very consistent with what Ken just showed. We expect moderate increase by around 1 degree in the region, 1-2 degrees in the near term. It will increase to 3-4 degrees in the midterm, and in the long term, go to 6-7, even 8 degrees. And the increase is consistent in the along with the same patterns, whether also again for temperature or precipitation, more rainfall on the tropic regions and less rainfall at higher latitude, and they are consistent also between CMAP6 and CMAP5. Also, if you use these CMAP6 projections, you can look at the heat wave changes, number of heat wave events. There is a definite increase. Number of rainfall days will increase, more flooding events, and since there are more number of days, wet days, there will be less number of dry days, so less droughts periods. This is if we look at the CMAP6 and we move we are happy with it and we use it for projections. What we got interested in these two slides that actually we just uploaded them a couple of days ago. We want to see how the CMAP6 and the CMAP5 look over the periods where we have data, but they didn't choose their data. So CMAP5 was released in 2005. So we have 16 years of data between the release and now, and we can use this data to see if CMAP5 is projections over these 15, 16 years data period reflect what we were seeing. Now, up is for the period 2006-2021. This is because CMAP5 released the projections in 2005. Down is 2015 because this is when CMAP6 released the projections. So down, it's 7 years data, 6 years period data, where we can see if CMAP6 over 6 years was doing something similar to what the data are showing. And up is for CMAP5. 1 minute. Okay, so what we see is that for the temperature, okay, they don't show the features, but they show the right trend and in the right direction, albeit to they are more moderate in the projections than what we're seeing in reality over the period where we have data. When you look at the rainfall, this is where things becomes a little bit more tricky, let's say, because what we're seeing in the last 15 years in terms of changes are quite different than what CMAP 5 and CMAP 6 are showing. And this poses a question of, how certain are these projections over, at least over our region in terms of rainfall. And I take this opportunity to announce, what got me here late. In principle, next week we'll be announcing a new initiative center to study and project climate change over the Arabian Peninsula with the National Center of Meteorology. It will be announced next week, and we will look specifically more carefully and about these projections and try to and we'll work on improving and providing information that are more robust for our region. Thank you very much. I'm sorry again.
Well, congratulations on that announcement to come, inshallah. And we're quite keen and eager to see what results will come out of it. So thank you for that, Professor Hoteit. We'll now move on to Dr. Mari Luomi, who's joining us remotely. Dr. Mari is a Sustainability and Climate Research Fellow at King Abdullah Center for Petroleum Studies in Riyadh. And Dr. Luomi will be speaking to us about the indicators of climate and food security in Saudi Arabia. Professor Mark Tester reminded us this morning that you cannot manage what you cannot measure. So hopefully this is a first attempt at trying to quantify that piece of the puzzle. So Dr. Mari, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Princess Mashael. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear me well, and greetings from Riyadh. I have been looking at climate change policy in the Gulf and internationally for the past 15 years. And most recently have been doing a bit of work on indicators, in particular indicators that enable comparisons across countries. And we've developed in this spirit here an index called the Circular Carbon Economy Index here at KAPSARC. So that's a little commercial break. I'd like to welcome you to explore it. It has its own website, so you can just type in CC Index and look at it. But also in the same spirit, when I got the invitation from Princess Mashael to contribute to this workshop, I thought I would try and identify some indicators that would enable us to look at Saudi Arabia and compare it in a global context in terms of how climate change and food security interlink. And how resilient is Saudi Arabia in this regard, and how is it contributing also to the challenge or the solution? Now, for this intervention, I identified 9 indicators that speak to the different aspects of this topic, and I placed them under 3 pillars. The first one is domestic agriculture and its sustainability in relation to climate change and water, which are the major interlinking environmental challenges for this region by and large. Second one is the resilience and adaptation to climate change and environmental change in the kingdom. And the third one is the sustainability of imports. We've heard it over and over again today, how important an area this is. And we just saw how climate impacts worldwide are also affecting potentially food security in Saudi Arabia in the future. And then a cross-cutting theme is policy there. Now, first a caveat, we heard from Professor Tester this morning that we have data-related challenges which affect not just the kingdom, but the world. This is the case for climate change-related data, food-related data worldwide. And having said that, we need data, and data can allow us to have, they can allow us to start conversations, have conversations. And when there are data issues, hopefully they can lead us to better data. So with that caveat, the first one under domestic sustainability that we can look at are the direct greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture from Saudi Arabia. On the upper right-hand side, we can see the estimated total greenhouse gas emissions of Saudi Arabia the past decades, and the green little line there is agriculture. So direct emissions are estimated to be only about 1% of the total emissions in the kingdom. On the bottom, we see what contributes to these direct emissions. That's mainly livestock and fertilizers through methane and nitrous oxide. And curiously, these emissions have remained pretty stable over the past decades, with one perhaps exception, which was around the financial crisis there. Now, on the same theme, if we add to this energy use on farms, on the gray here, the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions goes up to 300%. So it grows threefold. And here we simply see the different breakdown of these emissions, again, mainly from livestock related emissions and fertilizers. Now, another way to look at it is to compare greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture as a share of total emissions on the one hand. So what is the share of agriculture in total emissions? And then what is agriculture's contribution? What is its value added to countries' GDP? Now, globally, in orange, we see that on average, agriculture contributes about 16%, 15% of the total direct agricultural emissions. And then we'll see the value added, which is less, it's about 10% at the moment. So proportionally, agriculture contributes more emissions than it adds value to the GDP. For Saudi Arabia, there is a significantly lower contribution, both to emissions and value added, but the relationship is inverse. So agriculture contributes more than it, quote unquote, pollutes. Now, third, we've already heard through the day of agricultural water use in the kingdom. And here globally, in 2018, $1.11 were generated per square meter of irrigated agriculture, whereas in Saudi Arabia, this was lower. It was about $0.8 per square meter. So here we see that agriculture is a bit less water efficient than the global average. Then moving to the area of resilience. Notre Dame University has this well-known suite of climate change adaptation indicators, and under it, it has a number of indicators to measure the vulnerability of food production and demand. So I'd like us to just focus on the two ones there in the middle today. The second set of bars shows that Saudi Arabia's population growth makes it a bit more vulnerable in this index, at least, to food insecurity. But at the same time, given that it has a proportionally smaller rural population, it's less vulnerable, at least at a country level, than the global average. So again, these are different ways of measuring. I invite you to look at the index. It's a pretty interesting suite of indicators. Then still on the topic of resilience and water, we heard this morning that estimates on groundwater reserves vary highly for the kingdom. But here we have FAO data, and it, for example, affirms what is the common understanding, which is that withdrawal rates are unsustainable. Now, this only focuses on renewable freshwater resources, but still the rate of abstraction is significantly higher than the available resources, and also compared to the global average. Now, third, looking at the sustainability of imports, and specifically simply now on the security aspects. So we're forgetting about climate change for a moment. The cereal import dependency indicator is obviously a very common measure of food security. And we see that Saudi Arabia's dependence of cereal imports has been increasing from about 70 to well over 90% over the past 20 years. But as we've also heard today, this alone should not be used as an indicator of food security, because food security is also diversified imports. It's about stable relationships. It's about well-functioning global markets and so forth. So not only about being dependent on imports, it's also about purchasing power, as we see on this slide. Now, this slide shows the value of Saudi Arabia's food imports as a share of its total merchandise exports. What this does is captures the adequacy of Saudi Arabia's foreign reserves to pay for its food imports. And lower here means better. So this means that Saudi Arabia has a very strong purchasing power in terms of food imports. And in this sense is quite a secure position. Some authors have sought to measure how much food imports contribute to groundwater depletion in the source countries, so elsewhere. This study is a bit outdated. It's focused on 2010, but based on it, we can see that Saudi Arabia's contribution to groundwater depletion in its imports, through its imports, is higher than the global average, and on par with the MENA average, and less than the overall GCC average. And finally, the Global Food Security Index has sought to quantify, and we saw this index already today also, so I see we're going around similar themes. It sought to quantify countries' political commitment to climate change adaptation. And I've picked here the ones that focus specifically on food and climate adaptation. And here we see that there still are areas of work in terms of integrating agriculture into climate change policy, commitment on a political level to managing climate risk and exposure, and a lot of work on the policy side, according to this index. In this slide here, I've identified some of the challenges and potential suggested solutions that probably haven't been mentioned yet today, but what I will do in the interest of time, I'll save these for the Q&A part. So that's all from me today. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Luomi. We'll move on now to Ms. Leena Al-Olaimy, who will paint a picture to us of what would a public-planet partnership look like. Leena, you have the floor.
Thank you, Princess Mashael. So Professor Ken talked about global food trade, and I want to talk about another trade agreement we have, and that trade agreement is with nature. Natural capital, the value of nature's free ecosystem services, is worth upwards of $140 trillion. That's almost double the industrial economy or human GDP. So in essence, nature is our biggest social partner. And our default, especially when we're looking at sustainable development, is to look to the private sector to bridge the annual investment gap to achieve food security and all of the other sustainable development goals. And we look to public-private partnerships, but we're overlooking the opportunity to be more intentional about establishing public-planet partnerships. And by public, I mean the private sector, government, civil society, so essentially humans. And by planet, I mean the world's stock of natural assets, which include geology, soil, air, water, all species, microbial communities, flora and fauna. And by partnership, I mean mutually beneficial for the public and regenerative for the planet, with nature as both an innovator and a collaborator. So let me give you one of my favorite examples of a public-planet partnership. Let's take bees. Globally, 3 out of 4 crops grown for human food depend at least in part on pollinators. So healthy bees are critical to securing global food supplies, but as you probably all know, bees have been disappearing at alarming rates. So a Belgian social enterprise called Biodiversity developed a scientific tool that monitors the environment of a given area through analyzing samples from the beehives. Bees are not harmed during the process. It's a very small portion of pollen that's retrieved through a special pollen trap in the hive a few times a year. And through those samples, they're able to extrapolate data on the quantity and quality of floral biodiversity, the bees' reproduction rates, pollution levels of pesticides and heavy metals. And unlike traditional manual collection, which would be very limited and costly, bees can provide massive amounts of data at scale. So bees from a colony in a specific area visit around 4 billion flowers per year within a 1.5 kilometer radius, covering 700 hectares. That's like 700 football fields. So biodiversity actually managed to decrease the bee mortality rate to under 10% compared with the average of 30% in Europe, and therefore also contributed to greater food security. So this was good for the bees, and it was good for humans and good for food security. So to achieve food security, we need to establish these fair trade agreements with nature and design food systems that not only nourish us, but also nourish nature. So when we think about the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, we can think of it as the human and non-human residents, and a sustainable and secure food system will be dependent on all residents having their nutritional needs met. So this means shifting from extraction-based food models towards more regenerative models that enrich human and non-human food systems. And this is where marrying or afforestation objectives of the Saudi Green Initiative and the Middle East Green Initiative with food security can support this regenerative model. Agroforestry, which involves combining food crops and trees, improves soil quality, it enhances biodiversity, it's a more accurate reflection of natural, i.e. not monoculture environments. It sequesters more carbon than traditional farming, and it increases crop resilience and farmer livelihoods. And that doesn't only apply to terrestrial ecosystems. If we take mangroves, for example, they're also enhancing aquatic ecosystems and food security. Every hectare of mangroves is estimated to generate hundreds of dollars a year from fishing, forestry, carbon sequestration, as well as $5,800 of value in water and air purification, $3,600 in coastal protection, and $1,000 in recreation and tourism. So food security and reforestation really go beyond commodities. There's this intersectionality with trees functioning as therapists and purifiers by improving human health, reducing public health expenditure because of cleaner air, less respiratory diseases, improved mental and physical health. And the mangroves also serve as green infrastructure that increases coastal resilience to sea level rise. They're also economic partners that contribute to ecotourism, jobs, and GDP, and even increase real estate value. So there was a study by the US Forest Service that found that California's 9 million trees are worth over $1 billion, and 800 million of that is just from boosting property values. So this multi-goal, integrated and synergistic policy approach that we need towards sustainable food systems and other socioeconomic national objectives like health, risk, resilience, tourism, and jobs is the kind of approach we need versus siloed thinking about food security being separate from all of these other interrelated issues. And I think I'll stop there and leave the rest on how we might be able to apply this for the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Leena. Then definitely, without further ado, I'll give the floor to Dr. Khaled Alabdulkader. I can't think of a more promising or exciting, at least for me as a Saudi, endeavor than meeting the targets of the SGIs that are quite ambitious, 10 billion trees. So we look forward to hearing from you, Dr. Khaled, and how relevant is that to food security in the kingdom. So Dr. Khaled, the floor is yours.
Will take you through this journey in a short time. And I know that as you expected to get some good news in the end of this session. Even though it is a long journey and it started with some really challenging figures to Saudi Arabia a few years ago, which is estimated by a study by the World Bank, the degradation, the cause of the degradation in Saudi Arabia, environmental degradation, is around 86 billion. And mainly, there is many pressures in Saudi Arabia, such as grazing, logging, hunting, water pollution, urban development, air emissions, and others such as drought and dust storms. All of that generate big challenges to Saudi Arabia, and such as loss in biodiversity, loss in vegetation cover, and also increase in food insecurity due to reduced yields and loss of aquifers or lower aquifers. That's lead to a new institutional setup in the environmental schemes in Saudi Arabia, which is created 5 specialized institutions. One of them is the National Meteorological Center, National Center for Wildlife, National Center for Development of Vegetation Cover and Combating Desertification, and the Environmental Compliance Center, and a National Center for Management of Waste. The National Environmental Strategy has many ambitions, and to enhance and to give to enhance the institutional setup and governments are operational, and also to raise the environmental compliance through the government and non-governmental entities, and to improve the quality of life and develop the biodiversity in Saudi Arabia and the vegetation cover in the kingdom, and the capability to adapt for climate change and to raise the environmental awareness in the kingdom. This strategy has 4 pillars: improve health, as we listened and heard from the previous presentation, how that's the environmental improvement can very closely relate to the health of a human being, and also to enhance lifestyle and contribute to food security and create jobs. And that leads us to the big ambition and the SGI, the SGI, the Saudi Green Initiative, that it is announced last year, and it has 5 pillars. One of them is to increase the vegetation cover in Saudi Arabia, to conserve biodiversity ecosystem, to increase the share of clean energy, and to also to reduce the emission, and to transition to circular economy. And the target of the SGI is really to reduce CO2 and to plant 10 million trees in combating desertification, and to raise the percentage of protected area by 30% in the terrestrial and marine ecosystems. So in the 10 billion trees, there are three main consideration for to implement this big and flagship initiative. One of them is to utilize the native plant species that can tolerate the drought and tolerate the also water condition in the kingdom, and also to use the renewable water resources and to maintaining the ecological balance in the kingdom. And that will have a lot of benefits. One of them is direct food security, and also to enhance rangelands in the kingdom, and also species such as species like bees and others that will reflect positively and also in the food security, and to provide genetic material and crop improvement. And the 10 billion trees study now that we are conducting now, and KAUST is contributing in a big portion on that, and leading the scientific work with other institutions around the world, is to develop a strategic master plan for the 10 billion trees, which is the time scale and the resources required for to achieve that target. Assessment and optimization, the resources required to achieve that target. The assessment for a plantation program impact, socio-economic impact, and others. And also to develop implementation guidelines and the standards for this huge initiative. And here I will go quickly in some of the initiatives that announced by the National Center of Vegetation Cover and other centers and other entity in the kingdom. And here only I will give only examples for those initiatives. One of them is to rehabilitate and to and manage forests in Saudi Arabia, and that include rehabilitation more than 300,000 hectare of forests in the kingdom, and to reduce forest degradation, and by planting 6 million trees in the forests of Saudi Arabia. Second, to develop 50 national parks in the kingdom, that's including planting 10 million trees in the national parks of Saudi Arabia. By the way, nowadays we have more than 300 national parks in the kingdom, and we are trying to also to enhance and to increase that number. Another initiative led by also the National Center and to conserve and restore the vegetation cover in rangeland, and that's including in rehabilitation and managing rangeland in 8 million hectares. And another initiative is planting 45 million fruit trees in mountain terrace, and that's led by the Deputy Ministry of Agriculture in Miwa. And another also initiative to expand and develop the lemon crop using renewable water. Another initiative is by Royal Commission for Riyadh City, and that's including 7.5 million trees and 3,000 development of 3,000 parks. Saudi Aramco, they have an initiative to plant 100 million trees and to develop some of the national parks by 2030. And another initiative is to plant 100 million mangrove trees in Saudi Arabia. As you know, as you also heard from the previous presentation, how mangrove that contribute to the food security by increasing the marine aquatic life, and also enhancement of coastal areas, and also to increase the carbon sequestration in this environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khaled. We really look forward to spending time in those green spaces. I think after the past 2 years of all of the stress with COVID, people really want to spend quality time outdoors and hopefully in a changing environment. So we look forward to seeing all of this come to life. But then maybe I'll start my questions to Professor Hoteit. Because I definitely see the value in what you're doing with the creation of this new center and this new initiative. The government is most definitely sold, as they're the ones funding it. But why should the layman care about it? Why should the farmer care about it? People who are behind the implementation side of some of the projects like Dr. Khaled care about or see the value in the creation of these typologies of models?
So, you know, as we will, it has been discussed during this workshop. You know, the food production depends very much on the climate information, climate projections, whether it's on the long term or in the short term. Smart, you know, but we've been talking about smart agriculture here. Requires short-term information about weather forecast, what we call, but also the long-term planning from the government and the management of and the decision-making on what kind of food can we grow, or crops can we grow in the region. You know, foreseeing what's going to happen all depends on the required climate reliable. Sure. Okay. Reliable climate information. As I try to emphasize in here, there are these climate projections available, and they are being used at many levels. But what we're trying to get from the center is to improve and what I would say improve the certainty in these projections. Clearly what you've seen here, and there are some more results I didn't show. The trends are not matching between what being projected globally and what we are interested in regionally. And I'm hoping from this center that we will have more reliable information that could be used to optimize and manage and help, not only the food security, but many other sectors in the kingdom. The goal is to provide the information for many sectors, and that again, more central than what's available now and can be used again from different centers. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm a firm believer that if you need things to be done for your benefit, for your optimization, then you need to do it yourself. It took, I don't know how many versions of the IPCC reports. For those of you who don't know, the IPCC stands for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to grace our region with a hexagon. And that's the whole region. That's the Arabian Peninsula. So in terms of the micro detail that we need in terms of, let's say, the pixelation that's needed to make that kind of decision making, we're far from being there. So we really thank you for all of these very important efforts, Professor Hoteit. Now that takes me maybe to my second question, and I hope I'm not stretching it too much, Dr. Khaled. But for me, at least, environmental impact specifically and challenges in a lot of instances transcend national boundaries. There are some ways, maybe when you see a fence and you see if they're protected grazing lands, for example, the areas that are protected, you still have the coverage. Other areas you might not. But sometimes things that are like air pollution or particles of dust in the air don't really abide by these arbitrary fences, right? So whatever is happening within the delta, let's say in Iraq, definitely affects my day-to-day life in Riyadh in terms of the quality of air that I breathe, and in terms of the impacts and implications that might have on, the growth of children in the future, and the stressors that that's putting on the health ecosystems in our country. So we've heard about maybe the 10 billion planting target. I know that the Middle East Green Initiative takes it a step further to 50 billion within our region in terms of a commitment. What kind of importance do you see that in terms of a framework or a way of contextualizing that to ensure that there's effective action being met on the ground here? So what kind of symbiosis do you see envisioned between both programs, and the importance of which for the success of one another, I guess?
It's really these programs need to be arranged between all these countries. This is why we see that the 10 billion trees in the kingdom associated with another program that's the 40 billion trees. In total, it's 50 billion trees to share that responsibility between all these neighboring countries. As we see now, even in the dust storms, even though we have some spots of these dust storm as hot spots, but we see the impact that coming, crossing all borders, generating from countries to another. That's make the big importance of collaborating between these two countries. This is why we see also in other also environmental issues. There is collaboration between different countries, entities, and also treaties between the different countries, and also convention that require collaboration between the countries, and also to work together to solve problems, and also to trying to stop some impacts from crossing, improving also the condition that you have in your own countries. Responsibility is, even though it comes maybe from the individual as they see it, but it grows to the society, organization, also companies. Now we see there is increased interest in NGOs in the kingdom and also in the Middle East, between also the countries. So it is really a contribution by all to achieve that target. You cannot have a big impact and very sustainable impacts and sustainable environmental condition without those kind of collaboration between everybody, from government going down to individuals.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khaled. Then maybe if I stretch this a bit further in terms of a reflection, because there's a value that's not being captured in all of this, right? I think, Leena, you would know most, or will be able to speak to this the most. But our ecosystems have this service, what's usually sometimes called ecosystem services, that is not properly captured or valued, or maybe a real amount attached to it. These trees would be capturing carbon. They would be reinvigorating our soils. If chosen within the right kind of strands, we're putting forth within the ecosystem at large strains of trees that are a lot more beneficial. They have a lot of impacts and implications on health, on welfare, on cleaner air. If equally they're pushing the strains of technology or the limitations maybe for more effective water use, they're unlocking major potential that goes well beyond the immediate maybe scope of the project itself. So Leena, how would you sort of think of non-traditional financial mechanisms? Because all of this requires funding to deploy. And how can you ensure that the multi-goal objectives by the players within the country and externally, things that are tied to food security, climate resilience, and other social economic benefits are properly captured in sort of a real amount attached to?
Yeah, so this is the million-dollar question. It's very difficult to quantify. It takes not hundreds, but tens of thousands of dollars for natural capital. Ecosystem accountants or environmental economists, it can take months to do an assessment, which is not really scalable. So what we're trying to build is a machine learning model that would be able to provide not predictive analytics, but really a scenario analysis, because with predictive analytics, you're using historical data to predict the future, and you can't really do that with climate because there's so many interdependent variables, and it's, you're not predicting a churn rate. So the first step is being able to make those assessments in a way that is more scalable and with a high degree of accuracy. And then the next step would be being able to use back data to measure if those calculations were in fact accurate. So you start building almost this repository of data that values natural capital in health, like what was the impact of these mangrove forests or this reforestation on reducing diabetes or obesity or respiratory illnesses? By how much did property value increase in those areas? What was the cost of damages that was offset from sea level rise or in the future flooding? So all of these things need to be quantified, and this is possible to do now, it's just not as quick. The second part is then bringing in blended finance. So there's a structure called social impact bonds within the social sector, where essentially the government says, we are spending X on this issue. So let's say we're spending 10,000 reals a year on per citizen on diabetes or on obesity. And so the government would quantify the size of the problem, and an investor would come and put the capital for the reforestation or the impact initiative. There would be a third party that would verify that impact. And then based on the success and the metrics that were achieved, the government would pay the investor. So this is kind of a public-private partnership, and it hasn't really been applied in this context. So mostly social impact bonds have been applied in cases of recidivism, so with prison populations, but not within climate. And this is where I think it would be really interesting, because HSBC in Saudi has also launched a climate fund recently. And this is also a way to give private investors the opportunity to invest in climate solutions that are integrated. So again, it's not just about carbon, it's food, it's health, and all of these other things.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Leena. Maybe then I'll jump to Dr. Kenneth. The situation, the very sad situation that's unveiling in Ukraine has reminded us, or at least reminded the narrators in the US of a term that we are used to hearing whenever there are any issues, which is energy independence. I might be revealing my background a bit here. There's a lot of people that have been pushing for energy interdependence, but when you see these kinds of sort of surprise issues arising from left wing, it makes people or countries reconsider their approach to policy. So if we extend this a bit to food security, because what we've been hearing today from several colleagues, from Mark and others, is that we should be focusing more on what we could grow realistically, but then beyond that, be thinking of how do we optimize food security interdependence. So I might be a bit greedy after seeing that long list of yours, Dr. Kenneth, but what could be some unaccounted for risks for food interdependence? Sometimes we know what we know today, but what could future risks be that are yet to be identified? We cannot hear you, Dr. Kenneth.
One of the things that we have is when we look at the partnerships that have been developed with the countries, and I think that's what's important, is looking who your partners are and looking at the stability of that relationship in light of the climate forecast we're seeing. So as we've seen, one of the biggest, and we're looking at this now and trying to tie it with the others, generally countries that are attempting to be food self-sufficient, it's generally at the cost of nature, because the natural capital and the environment is not valued sufficiently. So for example, in Africa, there are wetlands known as dambos, which are becoming sources for rice irrigation. And they have great environmental and biodiversity value, but with the push to be food self-sufficient, for two reasons: can people afford imported rice? One, and where is that coming from? That's a stress. So if we can value our natural resources, but this threat, I mean, it started very strongly in 1980. I mean, again, we're coming back to the same partners with the US and Russia when we canceled our wheat deals very strongly, and we saw the fragility of food security, that people, based on politics and current events, countries could stop food supply. And we're seeing that now. We also saw that with oil embargoes and other things. So we see the fragility of trade as a mechanism, and the number one thing that countries want to do is provide food security. So there is the geopolitics that come in. Who would have ever thought about maritime bottlenecks, those types of things. But one of the things that people are really worried about, and as we've heard about the climate modelers, it's called the failure of multiple breadbaskets. Generally, the nature of the globe now is that if there's a drought in one part of the world, there's not a drought somewhere else. We sort of have an even keel. But what if all the breadbaskets of the world start having a drought in the same year or the same decade? What will that do for our food supplies? So these kind of things that we're trying to anticipate. And as we heard just a minute ago, scenario planning is a really important thing, because we have to try to develop robust supply chains for food for particularly countries that are very stressed for producing it. You saw 8-degree warming, 6-degree warming in the Gulf region, with already, even if the precipitation doubles, that will be more than swallowed up in crop water demands. So technology, understanding the groundwater resources, having that balance between using groundwater to meet some of these demands, those are the types of things we're going to have to be looking at. And also understanding what other types of threats that are coming. And one of the things we've studied recently is that even though it may be getting drier and hotter, there's going to be more flooding in urban areas in Saudi because the storms that are coming are more intense. We're already seeing that. So there's many threats to the infrastructure and to those things. So again, it is this blend of technology, nature, and institutions thrown in with a dash of politics that we can't have it really says we need to be training the next generation of policymakers to be broad and to have team analysis rather than solo analysis in single areas.
I could not agree more. I think the risk of climate change, by definition, would require you to be a multidisciplinarian to even be able to wrap your head around the problem, let alone all of these other issues that might be instigated once we've seen the impacts roll out. So maybe before I wrap up and invite the floor for any questions, my last question is to you, Dr. Mary, just to ground us on why we're here. Essentially, we're here to discuss environmental impacts and implications on food security, with a particular focus or a view of the impacts and implications of an ambitious target for the Saudi Green Initiative. What do you envision as some of the main challenges that are in the flanks, let's say, beyond the unknowns to the unknown unknowables, maybe, for achieving sustainable food security, and what might maybe the beginning or semblances of solutions look like? Not to dwell too long, because tomorrow is the solution day, but maybe focus more on the challenges aspect.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. And I have to say first up front to Kenneth that for us political scientists, there's always much more than a dash of geopolitics or policy there. So I might focus a bit more on the policy side here in these brief remarks. Now, I think one thing is very important that's come across very strongly from this session, which is that Saudi Arabia needs to care about climate impacts around the world. It's not so much about impacts in Saudi Arabia, perhaps, because food imports will continue to come from everywhere around the world. And I think, I'm not sure if this was mentioned yet, but the major crops at the moment, their production to global markets is highly concentrated. There's only a few key producers for each of the key crops, respectively. And so there is a challenge of availability, even if countries diversify their sources. And of course, it's incredibly important, the work that AEON and MIT are now doing on creating these indices. But at the same time, I think there are two key principles to climate action. One is mitigation, so reducing emissions. We can still avoid the problem in the first place. And the second one is building resilience to already unavoidable impacts. And so there, very briefly on the domestic side, what could Saudi Arabia do? Things that haven't maybe been said yet today. One, I think if you remember the slide on the on-farm energy emissions, so clean energy in agriculture could be one area. Related to that is climate smart agriculture. We've heard smart agriculture today, which is slightly different, but builds on similar principles. But climate smart agriculture specifically seeks to reduce emissions while building resilience. So this concept perhaps could be explored. And then another thing is, yes, emissions from agriculture in Saudi Arabia are obviously very small, because such a small share of production comes from consumption comes from Saudi Arabia. But my impression, at least, is that the country is a big meat-eating country still. And there's a huge trend in many countries now in moving towards plant-based diets. I know there are a lot of sensitivities and it's a cultural issue, but me as a non-meat eater, at least, I find it difficult sometimes to find non-meat food on restaurant menus. So maybe restaurants could start by increasing that offer. On the resilience side, we've heard over and over again, it's more resilient water use, groundwater use, maybe solar desalination. And then final area is making these imports more sustainable, both in terms of ensuring that the agricultural products that are imported, they don't contribute as much to emissions, but also that they contribute to increased climate resilience in their production, the countries that produce the food. And here I did a little paper on this 5 years ago, looking at the case of the UAE, but UAE is even more import dependent than Saudi Arabia. So same recommendations pretty much apply. Political dialogue, so bilateral relations with countries, existing trade relations like with China and India, where Saudi already exports a lot of oil, they could be the basis for strengthening the political ties with food producers. Trade relations overall, sustainable production could be somehow prioritized or given preferential treatment in trade. Climate finance or finance to agriculture in developing countries, it could be ensured that it's delivered based on sustainable, climate safe principles. And then finally, there are some agro investments from this region. So here too, there are a set of social and environmental principles that could be applied to also those investments. And then finally, the fourth bucket would be policy. So mainstreaming climate change across the policy, generating data, making it available, and then moving from there to data-driven policy. And I think that's what we've heard a lot on in this session.
Thank you very much, Mary. So if we have any questions in the audience, please. You introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks. Jonathan Jones from the Sainsbury Lab in Norwich, UK. I'd like to thank all the panelists for really very interesting contributions and analyses. That's all the day. And the question I'm going to ask is, could have been asked after the 3 of the 4 sessions, I think. And it's picking up on Mary's comment on meat. Because if it takes 1,000 tons of water to produce a ton of grain, and it takes 10 tons of grain to produce a ton of beef, well, you can work out how much water you're wasting when you produce a ton of beef, or using, perhaps I should say. So my question, really, picking up on Mary's point, and also alluded to in Dr. Strzepek's opening slide, I mean, to what extent do the panelists think, maybe a minute from each, or so, up to you, to what extent should governments be taking the lead in making the case to their citizens that there's a big environmental cost of a high meat consumption, and we need to reduce it?
Does anyone want to take it?
I'll start off. What we want. One of the things, I think this is very important. And what we need to do is be careful, though, to make these policies homogeneous across the planet. One of the things that we have to look at is where there's rain-fed agriculture and pasture lands, that becomes a natural capital for producing some of the beef. We have to look at where water is scarce and be very careful in those areas about that. But there are some places where there's plenty of water, rain-fed agriculture is there. We want to look at that. But the whole issue of meat and my diet has changed since using that, not being vegetarian, but maybe once a week. So we don't have to go totally to zero meat. There are many different ways we can go, and looking and informing the public about that. But there are still some places where it can blend with the environment with being care. But in terms of irrigated agriculture, I cannot agree more that if you take irrigated grains to produce meat, that is unsustainable, and we need to address that.
Did you want to add anything, Mary? Please go ahead.
Yes, 2 very quick points. First, I think in addition to water footprints, I think it's important to look at the climate footprints, so the emission footprints of food, obviously, and their meat has a very specific types of meat have very high carbon footprints. But then the other thing, I was listening to a previous session, and Saudi Arabia is a big country with a very diverse population in terms of also income, and I think we need to be very careful. I think a speaker say that there are people who are not getting enough protein. And so this needs to be a very targeted messaging, I think. Obviously, meat is often associated with higher income and welfare, so it has to be communicated very carefully. I don't know a single country that's doing it perfectly, but I think what should be made clear that meat does not equal to protein, or meat does not equal to good necessarily always to good quality protein. We can get good quality protein from plants, and I think that's a basic message that we could start with.
Yeah, if I may add to that, Mari, I think to all of your points, I think equally having cultural relevance and sensitivity to a lot of these sort of policy approaches should be of extreme importance, because you cannot impose something that would work in Asia to something that would work in a geography like Saudi Arabia, right? Pushing moderation, and I think this is what I try to do at least, constantly remind people that when we're talking about sustainability or some of these approaches, this is not something that's foreign to us. This is something that's within our own traditions that we might have forgotten because of an era of plenty, right? We had what's called a tafra that happened during the 80s. So that changed a lot of our behaviors internally. When we were more community driven, more moderate in our use and our intake of meats, because of the certain trade routes, our choices in our traditional dishes as well, that has changed over time. So reminding ourselves of where we started from and not imposing something that's fully foreign, I think is the right and the first way to go. So Rusty, I see you have the cube. Please.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Rusty Brainerd. I'm the Chief Environment Officer for the Red Sea and Amala Projects and a courtesy professor of marine science here at KAUST. And I want to applaud all of the speakers and Princess Mashael for this session, and as well as the earlier. From this most recent discussion, one of the things, actually all of the discussions, one of the things I haven't heard any mention of that really ties together the climate side and the food security side and this region where we are very arid and don't have fresh water is the use of marine microalgae, which is sequestering vast amounts of carbon, about 10 times as much carbon sequestration as mangroves, which have been mastered, but it's also incredibly nutritious for people and for livestock and many other parts. And this is an ideal place to grow it. So it could solve numerous problems at the same time, but it's often left out of the food security discussion. And it just seems like we need to get it in the discussion because it's such a valuable resource. And many of the areas that are also having food security issues are also desert arid regions that have salt water nearby that could be a very productive source of protein and nutrition for people and livestock.
I couldn't agree more. Specifically to your point, Rusty, I was reminded of this with Professor Carlos Duarte. There was a very innovative menu that contained maybe some ingredients that were not typical as well. So making the case for why this would make sense, I think within our ecosystem, when you're talking about macroalgae and the way that you approach it in the middle of the desert, maybe with pumping water, a lot of people might start questioning why this is sensical when you're trying to solve for so many other things. So connecting those interdisciplinarities and those multiple boxes that you're taking. Hello. Yeah, with one solution is of value. So thank you for that intervention. Please, we have a question in the back.
Yeah, thank you very much. Rick Klink from Regenco. Also, I want to echo, that was a terrific session. Thank you very much. The Saudi Green Initiative, it's an amazing initiative. My question is, now how do we use the global carbon markets to sustain all the investment and to grow it in the environmental restoration here in KSA?
Does anyone want to address it? Maybe Mario or Leena?
Go ahead, Mari.
I just realized, Leena, you probably have a lot more to say about this than me. I simply wanted to point out that there is a growing interest in carbon markets worldwide now, as we know, and this also applies to Saudi Arabia. And this is because the global carbon market rules were finally finalized in Glasgow at the climate COP in last November. And obviously there's a clear link here. We have a lot of net zero targets here in the kingdom by entities such as Aramco, I believe Strzepek as well. The country itself has a net zero target. So I believe that there is huge potential here in the forest in terms of creating offsets. However, these needs to be measured. So we need good measurement systems and data in place. And this will take time. So the sooner we start with the MRV and emissions reporting systems, the better.
Do you want to add anything to that, Leena?
Sorry, there was a bit of feedback. It's a bit difficult to hear. I actually can hear the feedback when I'm speaking as well. Okay, it's gone now. So I think what I would add is the problem with carbon is, to me, is two things. One is reforestation and afforestation in Saudi is going to be very water intensive. And so there's the carbon emissions from the desalination. So that's one issue with carbon. But the other is that my thinking is really to try and move away from just seeing trees as commodities. So it's not just carbon credits or timber or non-timber forest products. It's really seeing them as almost citizens. And I know that sounds a bit radical, but really seeing them as the non-human stakeholders and citizens of Saudi Arabia or of any country. And it's seeing their value in enriching, life beyond just the carbon potential. But if we're just looking at a technical perspective, yes, it would definitely need to be measured because you have to factor in the water desalination, which is quite a carbon intensive process.
Most of the 10 billion trees initiative is based on a nature-based solution, which is related to carbon sequestration. This is why we see there is a big interest in the plantation of like mangrove. 100 million trees that will be targeted by Saudi Aramco, and others also entities are targeting also to plant mangrove. Also, we are using the sewage treatment plants that generated from these facilities to irrigate also these plants, and using also different other mechanisms such as harvesting grains and also flash water that comes from the wadi systems. These one of the benefits for that is carbon sequestration, and that a lot of entities, they are now putting the standards and to quantify these carbon credits. But in addition, as the professor mentioned previously, that there is a lot of addition benefits for other than carbon, such as enhancing biodiversity, increasing food security, and also big impact and big positive impact and dust storms, and increasing also the health condition, also the economy, also enhancing the job securities and in many aspects. So carbon credits is part of the equation, but it's not the whole story.
One more question, please.
This working? Okay, now it is. I'm Ahmed Daoud, and I'm the Director of Innovation for the Royal Commission for Al-Ula. Thank you very much for an incredibly informative session, and within an already informative conference. My question is more about, a lot of the things that we're discussing, whether it's about meat consumption, whether it's about, how do we change from cultures of excess to becoming a bit more conservative in our consumption. These are all about behavioral changes, and a lot of the things that I hear us discussing in these contexts is about how do we incentivize industry, whether it's through carbon credits, whether we're doing carrot incentives or stick incentives. We're trying to motivate industry to change their habits, but industry really responds to consumer demands and consumer appetites. So how do we address and bring about these behavioral changes in the consumers? You mentioned, Your Highness, talking about how in the 80s there was a tafra, and that led to a lot of behavioral changes. But I don't see how, in the absence of availability of meat and capital, people will revert back unless we're incentivizing. I don't see a lot of my Saudi friends and colleagues switching to eating, an algae-based kapsa or a, or an impossible-based, impossible meat kind of kapsa. First, it's more expensive. You're wondering if I'm going to pay more to eat a burger or a kapsa that is more expensive and probably tastes like cardboard if you've never tried it. So how do we begin to incentivize these changes in consumer behaviors? How do we also change things like our actuarial models to understand that, okay, if you have a stronger negative impact or footprint on your immediate local environment, this may affect your property value and therefore your homeowner's insurance goes up. How do we build these incentive models into changing behaviors for the consumer?
I think that's a very important question, and probably one that we'll be tackling at length tomorrow, the aspects of incentives or solutions, let's say, whether they're policy related or technologically focused. It's a very big puzzle to solve for. To the point of Dr. Russi, I think it does have implications or applications, let's say, in the gastronomic space, but maybe very niche. To your point, it would definitely not take off society-wide. It only takes a look at the Impossible Burgers sort of insertion within the US market, where it essentially started, right? There are markets and there are people who would take this on, but it would not be done at scale that would leave the impact that we want to see. So we have to be innovative, we have to be creative, but we also have to be humble to know what we can or cannot influence. And I think the less time we waste in the spaces that we cannot influence, the more innovative we can be and effective in the spaces that where we can. To the point of Dr. Khaled, just to use this as an opportunity to wrap up, where we can do more of the science and more of the sort of illustrative, informed, evidence-based policymaking. We need more and more of Dr. Hoteit's, right? To actually know what's happening within our own system. We need to take it a bit further to really understand the value of some of these projects that we're doing and quantifying them. It's one thing for Aramco to tick a box, but Aramco is smart. They did not take the route while committing to neutrality by 2050 of mangroves. Should they not have known the evidence that's associated not with the tree itself? They're quite short and stumpy. We were told at one point that these trees are not effective as a tool for decarbonizing, but that's because we did not look at the sediment that's left in its wake. It's actually the most effective tree globally. In terms of mangroves, in terms of carbon capture, or let's say nature-based services, is our own mangrove. So we have to become a bit more and more innovative in how we look at all of these different pieces of the puzzles and how we share our data, how we quantify it, how we give scientists, policymakers, and business makers, business leaders as well, the ability to use said data to come up with more innovative ways of sort of financing these projects. And most importantly, I think in the bigger scheme of things is a focus on collaboration, because this is not something that we can do alone. Climate is for me the main issue when it comes to environment, because it's the biggest issue that will create more and more issues somewhere down the line. So to the point of Dr. Mari, there's a big role for mitigation. There are aspects to adaptation. There are aspects to the genomics. Everyone has a role to play. Dare I say, maybe people who aren't even in a room of a place like KAUST, the artists, the authors that could help put the message across to a much wider public. I think everyone has a role to play, and everyone must know or assess what role they can play and what could be the most impactful and effective way of doing it. And I'm really looking forward to tomorrow, and I really thank you for the opportunity to explore some of these causes. And a special thank you to everyone who stayed in the room. I know that this has been a stretch, and even worse with the food trying to send you to a lullaby. But thank you all for participating, and thank you all, especially for my panelists, for your invaluable contributions. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for staying until the end of what has been a very long day. But I think it was definitely worth staying to the end. Another really interesting session. And I think we're very well set up for tomorrow's conversation around how do we develop the solutions. The chairs of all of our sessions did an amazing job today. They selected the speakers and the topics and really curated the content of each of those sessions. So I'll ask you to join me in thanking Princess Mashael, Dr. Majid, Professor Matthew, and Dr. Suleiman in curating such a wonderful day today. Today, the experts in their field were able to highlight all of the challenges facing Saudi Arabia. Tomorrow, we deep dive down into what are the solutions. Should be a very interesting day. We'll start at 9 a.m, so please be in your seats ready to go at 9 a.m, so aim to get here a little earlier. We'll begin with a summary of today's proceedings from all of the chairs. We will be followed by sessions on alternative protein sources and sustainable plant production. In the afternoon, we break out into focus sessions again. So we'll have a focus session on education, saline agriculture, controlled environment agriculture, and regulatory frameworks. From 2:30, we split. At 2:30, we split into some breakout sessions, which are invitation only, to get some of the people who can identify and solve some of these problems together around each of those 4 areas to work together. And for others, there's some very interesting and informative tours of some of the spin-out companies from KAUST and the Centre for Desert Agriculture, which will be a real treat, I promise you. For now, there is a formal reception for this summit that will be held in the KAUST Beacon Plaza, and Anna is now going to stand up here and explain how you're all going to get there.
Hey everyone,